Tom Clancy, Novelist 1947 to 2013. I have been an avid reader my entire life. The first author whose works I devoured was R.L. Stine, starting with his Goosebumps series and then progressing to Fear Street. After that, I graduated to the military fiction of Tom Clancy. Since my father was in the Army and we lived on a few different posts, I was broadly familiar with most of the weapon systems that Clancy describes so vividly. This also occurred at a time in my life when I was increasingly interested in world events. By the time that I was in high school, I had grown rather bored with Clancy and moved on to other things. It was only a few years ago when I saw the film Can You Ever Forgive Me?, which had a scene where biographer Lee Israel, played by Melissa McCarthy, spotted Tom Clancy at a party for authors and disparaged his smugness and lack of talent. It was the first time that I had thought about Clancy in many moons. I hadn't even realized that he was dead. Ultimately, I did not follow up on my interest in the rest of Clancy's life and works until I was browsing the shelves of my local library and happened upon a literary analysis from 1996 covering his novels. Just as I had once been drawn in by thick paperback books with catchy titles and depictions of military hardware, I found myself once again drawn into the extended Ryanverse. Thomas Leo Clancy Jr. was born on April 12, 1947 in Baltimore, Maryland, to an Irish Catholic family. His father, once a well-known local baseball player, worked at the post office. Clancy failed to live up to his father's and his own expectations, as he was never a coordinated or capable athlete, despite having an athletic build and attaining a height of 6'2". His mother worked part-time at a store to help the family pay its bills. Growing up, Clancy had a brother and a sister and attended Loyola High School, a Jesuit institution. The combination of his home life and education ensured that Clancy remained an ardent Catholic throughout his life. Attending Loyola College, Clancy initially majored in physics. Clancy then enrolled in ROTC and fervently wished to become a military officer, but his poor eyesight precluded him from service, and this led to his dismissal from the program. The dream remained with Clancy, who continued to daydream about military service for the rest of his life. Although he had an intellectual bent, he did not have much of a work ethic at this point in his life, and found that he could not maintain good enough grades to get a degree in physics. He claimed that he switched to English because it was easy, and he wanted to get a degree. English was such an easy major that Clancy graduated in 1969 with a 1.9 GPA. By his own admission, he spent much of his time reading military history rather than his assigned readings, so why he chose English over history is a bit baffling. While at Loyola, Clancy met Wanda Thomas King, whom he married upon his graduation from college. Since daydreams of military glory had no financial value for him as of yet, Clancy attained certifications in insurance and got a job in Hartford, Connecticut, where he and Wanda lived for a few years. The couple would go on to have 4 children over the course of their 3 decades of matrimony. Given that Wanda was a nurse and Kathy Ryan, one of the characters who would later make famous, was an ophthalmologist, one wonders if his wife inspired the character who would go on to one day become one of the better-known fictional first ladies. In 1973, Clancy got a job with an insurance firm in Owings, Maryland, which had actually been founded by his wife's grandfather. Using his inside track, Clancy purchased the agency from Wanda's grandmother in 1980. Now that he was his own boss, Clancy did not have to work quite as hard, and could focus more on his hobbies. In his spare time, Clancy continued to be a voracious reader, and he also enjoyed the computer games of the era, particularly those with a strategy bent. He later said that while the insurance game provided him with a stable living, that he never found it to be particularly intellectually engaging. Now in his 30s, and with his chance to serve in the military having completely passed him by, Clancy decided to live vicariously through fictional characters, who would embody his values and live out his dreams. Both Clancy and his detractors have compared him in this early stage of his career as a real-world Walter Mitty. After a few years of researching and writing for a few hours a day, his first novel, The Hunt for Red October, was completed. A military thriller, the story follows CIA analyst Jack Ryan as he attempts to read between the lines and convince his superiors that the captain of the USSR's most advanced submarine was attempting to defect to the United States. The story was gripping, but it only attracted attention from one publisher, the Naval Institute Press, which was not known for moving reams of paper. Clancy sold the book for $5,000 plus royalties, confiding to his wife that he thought that he might sell 5,000 copies. Wanda, more optimistic, thought that her husband would sell closer to 50,000 copies. In 1984, thanks to an unusually aggressive marketing campaign by the head editor, The Hunt for Red October sold about 50,000 copies. That would be a solid debut, especially for an unknown author working for a minor press. But then a copy of the novel ended up being a Christmas present for President Ronald Reagan. Reagan read the book, liked it, and publicly recommended it, which led to an explosion in sales. When all was said and done, the only novelist to have more explosive success out of the gate was J.K. Rowling, and even then, the gap between them is actually not as great as one might suspect. One difference between the two authors is that Rowling was never investigated by her government for potentially leaking classified information, as many within the US government were unaware of just how much information is publicly available and neatly bound into volumes for those who care to search for it. They suspected that Clancy had been leaking information that should be classified. Needless to say, he actually had not done anything wrong and was not prosecuted of any crimes. Since The Hunt for Red October not only captured the zeitgeist of Reaganite Washington, but even got an endorsement from the Gipper himself, Clancy now found that every door in Washington was open to him. Not only could he hobnob with just about anyone in the defense establishment in a social sense, but he was able to get an inside look at military equipment and procedure denied to most civilians. This made his research going forward a great deal easier. Clancy's accurate details gave him access, and that access in turn helped him to maintain his accuracy. Readers found those details fascinating, and the endorsement of Clancy's work by soldiers, sailors, and spies made readers feel that they were getting a glimpse behind the curtain that no one else was offering at the time. Not only could Clancy navigate the halls of power with a backstage pass, but he proved to be perfectly suited for the media environment of the 1980s and 1990s. Unlike many authors, he seemed like a regular guy, and he displayed both wit and humility. Although he was only 38 at the time, Clancy's gray hair and tendency to dress like a VFW member made him seem older, and therefore more authoritative. With his aviator sunglasses, pressed khakis, hat celebrating warships, and polo shirts, he gave off retired officer vibes, an impression aided by the fact that he looked older than he was. While he showed an acerbic side, accusing anyone advancing a criticism of his writing style of being envious, and pointing to his sales as proof of his talent, Clancy tended to leave a mostly positive impression on most viewers. By the standards of the time, he was unusually open in expressing his political opinions. A conservative Republican who was in favor of intervention abroad, Clancy had the good fortune of rising to fame at a time when such views were increasingly in the ascendant. As for his fame and fortune, Clancy said that he had achieved success too late in life for it to affect him. As he transitioned into writing full-time, Clancy established a strict work regimen, working for a minimum of 4 hours on his computer each day. In his own telling, success made him eschew his slacker ways and become a workaholic. From 1986 to 1989, Clancy would produce 4 more novels. Red Storm Rising, written in conjunction with Larry Bond, was a standalone novel which imagined a world where the Cold War grew hot, and this led to a multi-front war in a number of locations around the globe. A prequel to Red October, Patriot Games came next, and explained how Jack Ryan established himself as a CIA analyst who sometimes fought in the field by saving the future King and Queen of England from the machinations of a stand-in group for the IRA. The Cardinal of the Kremlin, by contrast, involves America's highest-placed spy in the Soviet Union attempting to defect to the United States with the secrets, creating a deadly crisis which can only be resolved by Jack Ryan, who simply leverages the truth about the Red October to threaten the Soviet premier and secure the spy's safety. Clear and Present Danger debuted in 1989 and saw the beginning of Jack Ryan's rise to political prominence as he became deputy director of the CIA. This time, Clancy's favorite analyst was joined by the men who would become the second and third major characters in the so-called Ryanverse, Senior Special Operator John Clark and the much younger Ding Chavez, who would become Clark's son-in-law in future novels. In the story, the public is souring on the war on drugs, and the president, seeking re-election, is scaling down operations in South America. But our heroes are determined to keep the pressure on the Medellin cartel up and to kill bad guys. So they do what they feel is right and disobey the president. This celebration of illegal wars waged on the public's dime but against the public's will proved to be Clancy's greatest financial success to date, which is saying quite a lot given that all 5 of his novels had either been the bestseller of the year in which they were published or had come just short of attaining that position. Clancy was red hot as the 90s kicked off, and would prove to be an even more lucrative decade. In 1990, a film adaptation of The Hunt for Red October debuted with Alec Baldwin as Jack Ryan, James Earl Jones as Admiral Greer, Ryan's mentor, and Sean Connery as Captain Marco Ramius. Although often playfully mocked for having a Scottish captain at the helm of the USSR's most advanced warship, the movie was nonetheless a smash hit. This led to a film adaptation of Patriot Games in 1992, which saw the return of Jones as Greer and the debut of no less than Harrison Ford as Jack Ryan. In 1994, Ford and Jones reprised their roles in the silver screen adaptation of Clear and Present Danger. In 1991, The Sum of All Fears dropped and played up the new fear people had of a post-Cold War world of the chaos that could result from loose nukes. A rather fanciful coalition of East German communists, Palestinian terrorists, and the Iranians find an old Israeli nuclear bomb and use it as a template to create their own weapon. Their plan was to set off the bomb in Denver at the Super Bowl in the hopes that this would kick off a nuclear exchange between the Americans and Soviets. What that would achieve beyond wanton destruction is rather unclear, but of course the plan was foiled by the brilliance of Jack Ryan and company. In terms of creating high-stakes tension, this novel may have been Clancy's best. For what it's worth, I was quite impressed by this book when I read it as a teenager. After a year off to pursue his nonfiction interest, Clancy published Without Remorse in 1993. Back in 1992, his publisher purchased the rights to it, sight unseen, for $14 million, a record at the time. His darkest novel to date, this story follows a young John Clark in the Vietnam era. By birth, he was John Kelly, and he was a widower after a car accident. As part of his grieving process, he decided to help an escaped prostitute recover from her drug addiction. However, after he had taken her as his lover, the lady's pimp caught up to her and ended her time on this earth via involuntary sexual actions from a group of men. The pimp's only real mistake was only wounding rather than killing John Kelly. Kelly then goes on a revenge tour and even works in some more missions in Vietnam, all of them blood-soaked like a Rambo movie. Between those missions, Kelly spent most of his off days finding and killing drug dealers, and also the politicians who were in league with them in any way whatsoever. A detective in Baltimore named Emmett Ryan, the father of Jack Ryan, discovers Kelly's extracurricular activities and confronts him, and plans to arrest him. However, Kelly's CIA handlers show up to save him from justice and grant him the ultra-secret super nickname of John Clark. They also give him a license to kill, so long as the government approves. In terms of character work, this is probably Clancy's finest piece of writing, even if it is not quite what we'd call a deep character study. By the mid-1990s, Clancy was one of the best-known writers in the country, and every book he had published had been a bestseller, a rather uncommon feat. However, Clancy's writing attracted few fans among the literati. His critics pointed out that while he was excellent at explaining technical details, weaving complex international plots, and describing combat, that he was deficient in every other area. His characters, the critics said, were one-dimensional and lacked an inner life. In interviews, Clancy openly and proudly proclaimed that he did not care for moral ambiguity in his work, and he had no interest whatsoever in authors who wanted to explore gray areas. Ryan, Clark, and Chavez all shared Clancy's Roman Catholic faith, dedication to monogamy, unflinching patriotism, and black and white morality. In terms of personal struggles, Clancy's characters sometimes worry that they might not be spending enough time with their children, or that they need to pay more attention to their personal fitness. They rarely have moral dilemmas which reach the deep depths of the Red October. As his fame spread and he failed to charm other authors at parties, wits began to observe that Clancy more or less thought that he was the real-life Jack Ryan. There were even rumors that Jack Ryan's entry into politics in the novels portended an announcement by Clancy. But Clancy vehemently denied any interest in seeking elected office. Politics no doubt played a role in driving the disdain of his fellow writers, but Clancy's writing did have its limits, which had been reached by 1993. The critics were ultimately right, especially about Clancy's complete inability to write a remotely compelling sex scene, and the mustache-twirling quality and pure evil of anyone who dares to challenge America. Although he would continue to move paper and his books would all have highlights, he would never again produce another classic thriller. As the flamboyant flag-waving of the Reagan era started to fade, the appeal of Clancy would start to wane along with it, although this would be a very slow process. Having already established himself as one of the biggest names in military fiction, Tom Clancy decided to branch out into writing military nonfiction. Making use of his ability to meet with military officers and access government facilities, where his works were often read and admired, Clancy wrote or co-wrote 11 books between 1993 and 2004, all of which focused on some particular aspect of modern warfare. As was the case with his fiction writing, Clancy began under the waves in a submarine. Submarine, a guided tour inside a nuclear warship, was his first foray into nonfiction, and he followed it up with similar treatments of an aircraft carrier, a Marine Expeditionary Force, an armored cavalry regiment, a fighter wing, and other topics including a look into the Persian Gulf War. These books were well received, and generally appreciated by military personnel, but they did not achieve the kind of widespread readership of Clancy's novels. In 1993, Clancy joined a group of investors to become a stakeholder in his hometown Baltimore Orioles. One of his deepest desires was to take his father, a lifelong baseball fan, to a game in the VIP section. But his father sadly passed away in 1995 before this could come to pass. By this point, Clancy had also acquired his palatial estate overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. In his novels, Clancy's hero Jack Ryan and his wife Kathy live in a very similar home. However, the Ryans only had a net worth of $10 million. So the contours of their home were actually a bit more modest than those of Clancy's gargantuan real-life dwelling. Not only did the sprawling grounds afford plenty of privacy so that Clancy could work on his many projects, but it also featured an M4 Sherman on the lawn, which Clancy had received as a birthday present from his wife Wanda. Debt of Honor came out in 1994. In this novel, Clancy played into the already fading anti-Japanese sentiment that had been trendy a couple of years earlier to contrive a scenario whereby the U.S. punished Japan for defective gas tanks causing the death of 6 Americans by enacting trade policies to cut Japan off from exports it needed. Japan was then under a government of closeted imperialists who wanted to recreate the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Laughably, This ambition was encouraged by India and China. Launching a sneak attack on the US, the Japanese even managed to seize the Marianas before American troops defeated them. Jack Ryan had retired, but agreed to come back to D.C. to serve as the National Security Advisor. When the vice president was accused of rape and had to resign, Ryan agreed to step in as VP. Out of despair, a Japanese patriot drove his airliner into the Capitol building and took out every important person in Washington not named Jack Ryan. All things considered, Debt of Honor was fun, if wildly implausible. The biggest problem is that making Ryan the president meant that it would be harder to idealize soldiers and castigate politicians, one of the top themes in Clancy's works. Later, Clancy would claim that he had kind of predicted 9/11, although it is abundantly obvious that the airliner strike was intended to invoke kamikaze attacks. Clancy was 47 when he published Debt of Honor, and despite achieving an immense amount of success, he seems to have had a midlife crisis. For the first time since he wrote about Ramius's journey to the West, Clancy found himself experiencing personal turmoil of his own. Despite years of emphasizing his monogamous lifestyle and claiming that he deliberately made his sex scenes modest since he was a married Catholic after all, Clancy engaged in some extramarital dalliances of his own in the mid-90s. Although he and Wanda reconciled for a short time, they did eventually separate and then divorce. In 1997, his net worth was estimated at around $80 to $85 million. In January 1999, his divorce from Wanda was finalized, and among the things that it included was splitting his shares of the Orioles. Although his divorce was expensive, Clancy almost certainly made back his lost dollars and then some by the time of his passing in 2013. Perhaps contrary to his earlier claim, Clancy turned out to not be too old for his fame and fortune to change him. That same summer, 1999, he married Alexandra Llewellyn, the daughter of one of Colin Powell's family friends. The couple had a daughter together, making her the fifth and final child of the prolific author from Baltimore. Perhaps in part because he was juggling multiple projects at once, keeping a busy social schedule, and going through a divorce, Clancy's previous reputation as a more or less good and down-to-earth guy gave way to a widespread belief that Tom Clancy was an asshole. Perhaps Walter Mitty, having attained 00 status, found that there was a level of stress conspicuously absent from his wool gathering. Not only was he increasingly testy in interviews on the news, but in his personal interactions he tended to rub people the wrong way. American servicemen, many of whom were fans of Clancy, found themselves highly disappointed when they encountered him in person, as he was incredibly rude. Anecdotally, one of my dad's friends learned that I enjoyed Clancy's novels, and he picked up all of them at a used bookstore for a couple of bucks. A conservative libertarian army officer himself, he warned me that Clancy was one hero who was a nightmare to meet in person. Even in the 1990s, when the military was effectively 100% Republican after the post-Cold War downsizing overseen by President Bill Clinton, the same people who were put on a pedestal by Clancy and who agreed with him on virtually everything had no desire to be anywhere near the man. On the other hand, he seems to have mellowed out again later, as fellow author John Grisham remained his friend all the way to the end and continued to visit Clancy during his health struggles in later years. Up to this point in his life, gruff or friendly, Clancy had only presided over success. Op Center and NetForce would change that. In 1995, the Op Center novel series would launch, with Clancy giving a vague direction to the thing and other people writing the actual books. Meanwhile, a TV series would bring Op Center to life. The show flopped, and most of the novels were not well received, since the Clancy imitators lacked his ability to craft and manage details and maintain a brisk pace all the way through. In 1999, another book bearing Clancy's name called NetForce launched, and it was accompanied by a Scott Bakula-led TV movie. This also proved to be a flop, perhaps because the idea that the internet was the future had been done to death by this point. By contrast, the combined launch of the book and game SSN in 1996 was successful, even if only on a small scale by Clancy standards, which were admittedly very high. On the Jack Ryan front, Clancy continued to turn out bestsellers. In 1996, Executive Orders continued the story of President Jack Ryan. The new president continues to be assailed by terrorists, this time given a face by the Iranians, but still funded by the Indians and Chinese. Terrorists weaponized and spread Ebola, the virus that was in the news at the time, so Ryan could only deploy very limited resources to defeat the Iranian military. Due to their Americanness, the preposterously small strike force that he sends out succeeds, and their leadership is forced to come to America in handcuffs. Because the president himself threatens tactical nukes if the evil Iranians do not comply. The Ryan Doctrine, as it is known, which calls for leaders to take responsibility for their actions, is supposed to show Ryan's strength and how great of a president he is. It was at this point that the whispers of Clancy's detractors, who said that his novels had devolved into fascist fan fiction, started to ring true for perhaps the first time. Rainbow Six released in the summer of 1998 and was only half the length of the nearly 1,400-page Executive Orders. Arguably Clancy's last novel to have considerable cultural cachet, Rainbow Six is the story of Clark and Chavez founding an international spec ops group based in England and specializing in responding to terrorist actions. Some of the bad guys were not overly compelling, such as German environmentalist, but the novel does a great job of establishing a backstory for the video game series, which debuted the same year. This marks the first time in Clancy's career that he and his team were able to make the book and the other media tie-in work together and achieve success. From this point forward, he would lend his name to a number of other video game series. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six is still an active franchise to this day. The Bear and the Dragon in 2000 saw President Ryan trying to navigate a war between China and Russia, while also attempting to punish the Chinese for their prior perfidy by recognizing Taiwan. Sales remained great, but reviews were mostly negative, noting that the picture of the Chinese comes across as rather racist, and the book seems to be more of a vehicle for right-wing politics than a story as such. Red Rabbit, set between Patriot Games and The Hunt for Red October, centered around the real-life attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II in the early 1980s. It sounds fascinating, and it is a surprising choice for Clancy, given that this was his first novel since 9/11. Intriguingly, Clancy's writing was actually praised. Personally, I tried to read Red Rabbit not long after it came out, and I quit after 30 pages of Jack and Kathy Ryan talking about the drapes and curtains of their new mansion. The Teeth of the Tiger in 2003 was Clancy's final novel as a solo writer, and featured Ryan's first term as president coming to a close, but not before he founded a new covert agency designed for Black Ops and known as the Campus. His son and 2 nephews would go on to be operatives, naturally. The Campus was essentially a recycled and revamped version of Op Center, and it seems to have been personally loyal to President Ryan, which surely can't be good. Also in 2002, Clancy's novels would return to the big screen, with The Sum of All Fears being adapted as a film. Ben Affleck portrayed Jack Ryan, Morgan Freeman played Admiral Greer, and the movie's bad guys were now Austrian neo-Nazis rather than Islamic terrorists. This way, the movie would not hit too close to home. Given the volume of interviews that Clancy did about 9/11 and the threat of Islamic terrorism, in all of which he expressed himself quite candidly, it is rather amusing that Paramount Pictures treaded so carefully. I can only assume that much of Clancy's reputation for sharing acidic feedback about how people were handling his stories and characters stemmed from the production of this film. This was the last time in Clancy's lifetime that one of his novels would become a film. Later, in 2021, Without Remorse was adapted into a film for Amazon, although it was generally panned. Between Clancy's frantic work schedule and his heavy smoking, it is perhaps not surprising that the author suffered a heart attack around 2007. This was not well publicized, and we only know about it because John Grisham mentioned it in passing when Clancy himself passed away in 2013. Clancy was diagnosed with heart disease, and his output slowed considerably, although he was determined to forge ahead. From this point forward, he had to work with other writers to get his stories written. From 2010 to 2013, he worked with 3 different co-authors to crank out 5 more novels. The cumulative effect of these 5 books was to establish Ryan's son, Jack Jr., and his nephews, Dominic and Brian Caruso, as lead characters. Interestingly, in his last book, Command Authority, Clancy depicted President Ryan stepping in to prevent President not Putin from overrunning Ukraine. For all of the goofy plots he had engaged in over the years, he ended on a high note when it came to realism. On October 1st, 2013, Clancy died of heart failure. 2 months later, his final novel was released. The Orioles honored him throughout the 2013-14 season by wearing a patch on their sleeves. Due to the branding agreements he made, Clancy ensured that new products bearing his name will continue to hit the market for years to come. With the blessing of the Clancy estate, consisting of his second wife and 5 children, other authors have continued the story of the Ryanverse with 2 novels per year, pushing the story forward. Jack Ryan served out the remainder of his predecessor's term, had a presidential term of his own, and then retired, but of course not before granting blanket amnesty to everyone at the campus, only to then come out of retirement again to protect his reforms, winning a second non-consecutive term. The Ryanverse is now in the year 2012, and Jack Ryan is nearing the end of his second term, so it will be interesting to see what Clancy's successors do with Jack Ryan. None of the Clancy books or the novels written under his label have really had that kind of deep cultural penetration since Rainbow Six, so whatever solution his successors come up with will most likely require some serious digging for those who are curious, since it is unlikely that it will be headline news. Perhaps the brighter part of his legacy, and something that Clancy as a gaming enthusiast would appreciate, is that successful video games bearing his name continue to be relevant to this day. Rainbow Six has been going strong since 1998, whereas the Ghost Recon series and Splinter Cell date back to 2001 and 2002 respectively. In console generation terms, Rainbow Six dates back to the original PlayStation, and the other 2 long-tenured franchises go all the way back to the PlayStation 2. Tom Clancy's The Division launched in 2016 and was followed by The Division 2 in 2018, which is possibly the most critically acclaimed game bearing the author's name. For context, the PlayStation 5 is Sony's current console. Tom Clancy's forays into fiction were formative for me, even if I completely reject the political underpinning and implications of his work. Only over the course of time have I come to realize that while his influence in some quarters runs deep, it barely exists at all for much of the American public. In today's political climate, where American imperialism abroad is distinctly unpopular, and imagining a world wherein a crushing electoral victory for an intellectual with shady CIA ties seems more fantastical than the existence of Hogwarts, it is likely that Clancy's older properties, which captured the spirit of the last stage of the Cold War so well, might remain popular, but that all of the stuff after that will continue to have a rather narrow appeal. It is entirely possible that one day Tom Clancy will be known almost exclusively for the video games which bear his name. Whatever the fate of his various intellectual properties, it does seem rather unlikely that he will ever be entirely forgotten.